Robert E. Howard, Mak Morn, and the Picts. By Rusty Burke and Patrice Lunet. "There is one hobby of mine which puzzles me to this day," wrote Robert E. Howard to H.P. Lovecraft in 1932. "That is my interest in the people which, for the sake of brevity, I have always designated as Picts. I am of course aware that my use of the term might be questioned, but to me Pict must always refer to the small, dark Mediterranean aborigines of Britain. This is not strange, since when I first read of these aborigines they were referred to as Picts, but what is strange is my unflagging interest in them. The Picts are the only fictional creations to appear throughout Howard's writing career. Only one other creation, Francis X. Gordon, El-Borak, appears at both the beginning and the end of Howard's career, but he was notably absent from the early 1920s until 1934. Picts, on the other hand, appear in no fewer than 30 stories, poems, and fragments, from the West Tower, probably written circa 1922 to 1923, a Steve Allison fragment, to The Black Stranger, one of the last Conan stories, probably written in 1935, and rarely a year passes that they do not appear in some story. It seems likely that, had he lived longer, the Picts would have surfaced again in his work. The Picts appear in many different contexts. In the second story Howard sold professionally, The Lost Race, they are living underground, apparently somewhere in the south of Britain, having been driven there by Celtic invaders. In the Mak Morn tales, they are the pre-Celtic inhabitants of Scotland, fighting back the invading forces of Roman Britain. In the stories of Turla O'Brien and Cormac MacArt, they are the last surviving remnants of Bran's people, now pitted against the Norsemen who have established themselves in the remote northern islands off the coast of Scotland. In the Cull series, they are barbaric allies of the Valusian king, while in the Hyborian age of Conan, they are the savage inhabitants of a wilderness that stretches from the western borders of Aquilonia to the sea. In the James Allison stories, they are a bestial, jungle-dwelling race. Always, they are at the outer fringes of the world. Howard told an interviewer, "The first character I ever created was Francis Xavier Gordon, El-Borak. He came to life in my mind when I was about 10 years old. The next was Mak Morn, the Pictish king. He was the result of my discovery of the existence of the Pictish race when reading some historical works in a public library in New Orleans at the age of 13. Somewhat earlier, Howard had told H.P. Lovecraft that he had first read of the Picts in histories of Scotland, of which he was an enthusiast, but that these had been bare mentionings, usually in disapproval. Then, when I was about 12, I spent a short time in New Orleans and found in a Canal Street library a book detailing the pageant of British history, from prehistoric times up to, I believe, the Norman Conquest. It was written for schoolboys and told in an interesting and romantic style, probably with many historical inaccuracies. But there I first learned of the small, dark people which first settled Britain, and there they were referred to as Picts. I had always felt a strange interest in the term and the people, and now I felt a driving absorption regarding them. The writer painted the aborigines in no more admirable light than had other historians whose works I had read. His Picts were made to be sly, furtive, unwarlike, and altogether inferior to the races which followed, which was doubtless true. And yet I felt a strong sympathy for this people, and then and there adopted them as a medium of connection with ancient times. I made them a strong, warlike race of barbarians, gave them an honorable history of past glories, and created for them a great king, one Mak Morn. While, in the absence of a definite statement from Howard, we cannot know with real certainty which book it was in which he found the Picts, methodical research has finally yielded a very strong candidate, The Romance of Early British Life, From the Earliest Times to the Coming of the Danes, by G. F. Scott Elliott, London, Seeley & Company Limited, 1909. The book fits so many of the particulars in Howard's description, and in it we find so many descriptions and incidents which find resonance in Howard's work, that one almost feels it has to be the book in question, especially in the absence of any other candidates. In discussing the spread of Neolithic culture from the region of the Caucasus and Mesopotamia, across northern Africa and into Spain, for instance, Scott Elliot writes, "This was the first race of man to be thoroughly domesticated. Like the sheep, goats, and oxen which they brought with them, they had been themselves tamed, trained, and taught to labor. Their descendants still exist all along the Mediterranean, and not only there, but in our own islands. This people, or rather this race of mankind, has been called by many different names. The most sonorous is not doubt Homo Mediterraneus, but they have also been called Basques, Iberians, Silurians, the Firbolg, the dolmen builders, the Picts, and eaters of garlic. We shall call them Picts, because this is the shortest name, and by using it we shall save time, labor, ink, and paper in writing about them. These Mediterraneans are the people whom Scott Elliot says migrated to Britain in Neolithic times and slowly wrested the islands from the previous inhabitants, a race of red-haired cave-dwellers. Interestingly, he fabricates a little story about a party of Picts from Brittany preparing to paddle across the English Channel in dug-out canoes loaded with their possessions and livestock. A strong force of the oldest men in the settlement, well armed and watchful, were seeing off the party of emigrants. These were all young men, mostly of a disagreeably bold and enterprising disposition, and of young women who were inclined to be insubordinate and disrespectful to the heads of the tribe. So they were selected as being the best to depart, not merely for their own good, but for the future peace of the old settlement. Compare this with the story told to Cororic by the ancient Pict in The Lost Race. Our people came from the south, over the islands, over the inland sea, over the snow-topped mountains, where some remained, to stay any enemies who might follow. Down into the fertile plains we came, over all the land we spread. We became wealthy and prosperous. Then 2 kings arose in the land, and he who conquered drove out the conquered. So many of us made boats and set sail for the far-off cliffs that gleamed white in the sunlight. We found a race of red-haired barbarians who dwelt in caves." One of the most powerfully suggestive correspondences between the romance of early British life and Howard's Pictish stories is in the chapter Scott Elliot titles My General Agricola. In it, he tells the story of a Tungrian serving in the Roman legion in Britain, and relates their troubles in Caledonia. We, the second cohort of Tungrians, would go in front and choose the road for the legion. Then a few of us would go first and watch carefully for an ambush. Often there would be a sudden storm of stone-headed arrows upon us. A Caledonian might be lurking behind every tree or any boulder, and they are clever at concealing themselves. A soldier of ours was cooking his dinner beside a small pool and had been there 2 hours watching the banks of it. Then he turned his back, and a savage came out of the water below where he stood and pierced him with his spear before he could turn around. They can stay for hours together with only the lips and nose above water, and no one can see them if the water is dark or full of reeds. Compare this with the story told by the Norse narrator of Men of the Shadows, particularly the incident in which Romans are killed on the shore of a lake. Scott Elliot's outline of Pictish history is generally in accord with the scholarship of the day, differing from the mainstream only in using the term Picts to designate these Mediterranean invaders of ancient Britain. Most authorities seem to have preferred the term Iberians, but for the most part they agreed that this short, dark people had spread across most of Western Europe from North Africa, though it was not known if they had originated there, eventually migrating into the British Isles, and were the bringers of Neolithic culture. They were thought to be related, though none could say precisely how, to the Basques, and some speculated that they were kin to the Silers, ancient Welsh, Picts, ancient Scots, Lapps, Finns, and other remnants of pre-Celtic peoples. Because they were thought to have originated in northern Africa and were physiologically similar, they were thought by some to have been related to the Berbers. Of Howard's first attempts to write about the Picts we know little. In his January 1932 letter to Lovecraft, he mentioned a long narrative rhyme which I never completed, and in which I first put Bran on paper. saying he had told it through a Roman centurion on the wall. A listing of Howard's poems made by his agent, Otis Adelbert Klein, after his death, included one titled Mak Morn, with the notation that it was 10 pages long. Unfortunately, this poem has not surfaced and may be forever lost. In a letter dated October 5, 1923, Howard told his friend Clyde Smith of a book he was writing for my own amusement, which featured, among others, Mak Morn, who was the greatest chief the Picts ever had. This work, too, has not surfaced. Possibly Howard did not get far with it. Note, the story has been found. Return to Untitled. The earliest work featuring Bran or the Picts that we do have is Mak Morn, 3 handwritten pages on composition paper, probably dating from Howard's high school days, circa 1922 to 23. It is set during a time when the Picts are warring against both Gaelic and Norse invaders, but Bran apparently sees a greater foe looming. A hard, thankless task it is to raise the Pict nation out of savagery and bring it back to the civilization of our fathers, of the age of Brennus. The Picts are savages. I must make them civilized, because I know that no barbarian nation can stand before Rome. Here is our earliest glimpse of a theme that will run throughout Howard's dealings with the Picts. They are a once great civilized race, fallen into barbarism or savagery. This theme, of course, finds echoes in much of Howard's other work as well. Another work that apparently dates from 1922 to 23, also handwritten, consists of 4 pages outlining the history of the Picts and Celts in Britain, essentially following the story as found in The Romance of Early British Life. Of some interest is his account of the immediate aftermath of the Celtic invasion. After relating that most of the Picts had fled to the mountains in the north, what are now the Scottish Highlands, he notes that one group, who came to be called Silurians, had fled instead into Wales. The former group, he said, had eventually begun intermarrying with the red-haired savages who had preceded them. The latter were a different story. For some reason or other, the Picts as Silurian that fled to Wales did not unite with the cavemen's descendants, and the early types of Picts remained unchanged, except as, later, they were altered by intermarriage with the Celts, fleeing before other invaders. And to this day, in mountains of western Wales are still to be found traces of the ancient Pictish type. It is these Picts as Silurian who figure in Howard's first, so far as we know, completed story of these people. In the fall of 1924, Howard got his first literary break when he sold Spear and Fang, a story about cavemen, to Weird Tales. The 18-year-old had been submitting stories to professional magazines for about 3 years, and this was his first sale. He hastened to follow up. According to his fictionalized autobiographical novel, Post Oaks and Sandroughs, there lingered in the back of his mind a desire to glorify the Neolithic man, a hangover from some imagined romance of his early childhood. So he followed up Spear and Fang with a wild tale of early Britain, the lost race. The story was returned to him by Weird Tales editor Farnsworth Wright. As for The Lost Race, he had found several faults with it, in that it left too much to the imagination and left some important facts unexplained. However, the editor professed himself ready to take the story if the changes and additions which he suggested were made. Post Oaks and Sandroughs, page 35. Howard had used the thinly disguised titles Talon and Bow and The Forgotten Race. Though he felt a sinking of the heart when he contemplated rewriting The Lost Race, Howard did make the changes sought by Wright, and the tale became his second sold to and fourth published in the magazine, appearing in the January 1927 issue. The Lost Race, like Spear and Fang, is a relatively straightforward adventure story, with little of the truly weird in it. A Briton named Corrick is traveling from Cornwall to his home somewhere to the east, when he is captured by a band of very small, dark-complexioned men, armed with stone tools and dressed in furs. They take him to an immense cavern where he is brought before their apparent leader, an incredibly ancient man, from whom he learns that these people are Picts. He is incredulous. Picts? I have fought Picts in Caledonia. They are short, but massive and misshapen, not at all like you. They are not true Picts, the ancient tells him, and relates to him the story of the lost race, which we have already quoted above. Coruric is bewildered by the ancients' evident hatred of him and of all the Celts. That these people were even human, he was not at all certain. He had heard so much of them as little people, tales of their doings, their hatred of the race of man, and their maliciousness flocked back to him. Little he knew that he was gazing on one of the mysteries of the ages, that the tales which the ancient Gaels told of the Picts, already warped, would become even more warped from age, to result in tales of elves, dwarfs, trolls, and fairies, just as the Neanderthal monsters resulted in tales of goblins and ogres. There is little in this story of the Picts that we do not find in Scott Eliot's book, save, of course, Howard's passionate intensity. As for the stories Coruric had heard, already becoming warped, we find in Scott Eliot a great many stories of giants are probably dim and jumbled-up traditions of the tall, red-haired cavemen seen by the first Picts who invaded Britain. But at a much later period the conquering Pict is himself overcome by the Gaelic Celt. Then it is his turn to become a malignant gnome, a dark little dwarf, whose stone arrows are much to be dreaded. It is by no means improbable that the little people, that is, the small dark Picts, did live on for many years in those underground houses of theirs. This idea was not original with Scott Eliot, of course. Numerous writers of the time expressed the idea that fairy tales and myths must have some basis in historical fact. The Lost Race was accepted by Weird Tales in January 1925. It was not published until 2 years later. It is just over a year later that we find evidence of the next story of the Picts, when Weird Tales editor Wright rejects Men of the Shadows, saying, "I thoroughly enjoyed Men of the Shadows, but I fear I cannot use it in Weird Tales. It is too little of a story, despite the vigorous action in the opening pages. It is rather a chronicle of a tribe, a picture of the evolution of a race, and thereby it lacks the suspense and thrill that a story of individual conflict and hopes and fears and drama would have." This is, so far as we now know, the first completed story featuring Mak Morn, and, while Wright's comment that it is too little of a story seems just, it is a seminal work for our understanding of Robert E. Howard's conceptions of the Picts, with its lengthy history of the race, as told by an aged wizard. It is here that we find new elements grafted onto the story of the Mediterranean race. Men of the Shadows is narrated by a yellow-haired Norseman who has served with the Roman legions manning Hadrian's Wall. We have already noted that the Romance of Early British Life also told the story of a Roman legionary serving in Caledonia, and that the incident by the lake, in which our narrator's final 2 companions are speared by a Pict who has submerged himself, very clearly echoes a similar incident in Scott Eliot's book. The narrator is captured by the Picts, but they are stayed from killing him by the command of their leader, before whom he is brought after he is recovered. When this chief refers to the Picts as "my people," the Norseman remonstrates, "But you are no Pict." "I am a Mediterranean," the chief replies. "Who are you?" "Mak Morn." "What?" I had expected a monstrosity, a hideous, deformed giant, a ferocious dwarf built in keeping with the rest of his race. "You are not as these." "I am as the race was," he replied. "The line of chiefs has kept its blood pure through the ages, scouring the world for women of the old race." Bran, then, is a pure Pict, while the rest of the race has degenerated. The ancient in the Lost Race had said the Picts of Caledonia were not true Picts. We will recall that in both Scott Eliot and The Lost Race, it was suggested that the Picts, pushed by the Celts into the wild hills of the west and north to which they had themselves pushed the earlier red-haired cavemen, had interbred with their savage predecessors and became a race of monstrous dwarfs. Because the line of chiefs had kept its blood pure, though, Bran represents the race as it once was. We can only wonder what his relationship to the Silurian Picts might be, for Howard does not make it explicit. The Norseman is then witness to a confrontation between Bran and an aged wizard, what appears to be a contest of wills, a combat between the eyes and the souls behind them. When Bran has triumphed, the ancient relates to his listeners the history of his race, and we find some remarkable new elements now grafted onto the story of the Picts. We learn that they were a nameless tribe in the beginning, and had their origins somewhere in the northwest of the continent we now know as North America. They were the first race of men, though beast men, Neanderthals, preceded them. The second race were Lemurians, the third race Atlanteans, also identified as Cro-Magnons, and the fourth race Celts. The beast men, who may be identical with the reindeer men, red-haired savages, first fled southward before the nameless tribe, then crossed over to Africa via a chain of marshy islands, then northward into Europe. The Picts, or nameless tribe, first drifted from their original home to islands southeast of there, then fled eastward when a cataclysm destroyed their islands, now mountain peaks, then migrated into South America during the Ice Age, and then moved on to Atlantis, driving the Atlantean Cro-Magnons into Europe, where they displaced the Neanderthal beastmen. Following an internecine conflict, a portion of the nameless tribe migrated to Africa, and from this point their story follows the historical one. These new elements appear to be derived from several sources. The first race and successors come from Theosophy, a quasi-religious movement founded by Madame Helena Blavatsky in the 19th century. Her work was a hopeless gallimaufry of quasi-oriental religion and philosophy combined with imperfectly understood science, or more frequently her rantings against science, and anthropology, not to mention flights of pure unbridled fancy, but she attracted a huge following. It is possible that Howard learned of Madame Blavatsky's theories of the root races and sub-races of mankind through friends acquainted with occult literature or through secondary sources. It would not appear that he had read Blavatsky's own work, for he does not follow her identifications of the races in most particulars, certainly not her ludicrous physical descriptions, nor does he seem to allude in a direct way to any of her ideas. Another source for these ideas appears to have been the work of the British folklorist Lewis Spence, particularly his The Problem of Atlantis, 1924, and Atlantis in America, 1925. In these works, Spence brings together a great mass of geological, botanical, anthropological, and other evidence, together with accounts from classical sources, in an attempt to prove the former existence of an Atlantean continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Spence, having written a number of scholarly treatises on the folklore of many cultures, was able to make it all sound convincing enough, at least to readers with no particular scientific knowledge, or those who wanted to be convinced, as apparently he did himself. His books have a much greater aura of plausibility than those of the occultists. Spence's argument, in brief, hinged upon the sudden appearance of the Cro-Magnons in southwestern Europe, and the assumption that, since no evidence of an earlier transitional stage was known, they must have acquired their culture somewhere other than Europe or Africa. He attempts to tie together a great mass of anthropological data to show a common culture complex spreading through Africa, Europe, and the Americas at roughly the same time, suggesting that this culture must have originated at some midpoint between those lands, a place no longer accessible to archaeologists, Atlantis. This identification of Atlantis as the source of Cro-Magnon man and his culture seems to have been original with Spence, and as we have seen, Howard identifies the Atlanteans as Cro-Magnons. Atlantis in America goes into greater detail on the American evidence for his thesis and includes a chapter, The Analogy of Lemuria, which presents a brief outline of evidences adduced by other writers for the previous existence of a Pacific continent. Howard must have encountered these ideas between the writing of The Lost Race, accepted in January 1925, and Men of the Shadows, rejected March 1926. Late in July 1925, Howard began a story called The Isle of the Eons. He appears to have written the first 26 pages of the story, which are fairly straightforward action, in that month, then set the tale aside for a time. He then resumed writing the story at about the same time he wrote Men of the Shadows, that is, early 1926. He took up the tale where he had left it and wrote an additional 17 pages, bringing the total to 43 pages, leaving the story, once again, unfinished. He would return to this draft once more in 1927 or 1928, and then write 2 other drafts in 1929. The 1926 portion of the first draft ends as the unnamed Dutchman of the story deciphers some hieroglyphics, concluding that the isle on which he and his companion have been stranded is a remnant of Lemuria. Lemuria is to der Pacific, but Atlantis is to der Atlantic, von Kaelman always said. Dot they had a great civilization when der men on Atlantis were still apes, who were der ancestors of the Cro-Magnon peoples. From Unpublished Draft, page 43. It seems possible, perhaps even likely, that Howard stopped working on The Isle of the Eons to write Men of the Shadows, a story in which he would refine and develop these new ideas. We may also note that the 1926 section of The Isle of the Eons provided new information about the buildings and ruins found on the island, including a number of allusions and comparisons to Central and South American monuments or cities. While Spence posited that the pre-Columbian cultures of South and Central America owed much to Lemuria, Howard's source for the new material in the Isle of the Eons seems to have been not Spence, but E. A. Allen's The Prehistoric World, or Vanished Races, published in 1885, a copy of which was in Howard's library. In this book, Howard not only found names and descriptions he could use in the Isle of the Eons, but also found several chapters that no doubt commanded his attention in view of his interest in the Picts. Chapter 6, for example, is devoted to the Neolithic Age in Europe, and particularly to the Turanians. The word Pict does not appear in the book, but we can read that history, tradition, linguistics, and ethnology conspire to fortify the conclusions that, in prehistoric times, all Europe was overspread by the Mongoloid Turanian race, of which remnants have survived to our own times in the persons of the Basques, Finns, Eths, Lapps, and some smaller tribes. As to their physical description, it conforms to that of the writers we have already mentioned, a race of people small in stature, dark-visaged, and oval-faced, fond of war and the chase, yet having a rude system of agriculture. Allen's book, of course, makes no mention of a possible Atlantean or Lemurian connection for the Picts, and his Turanians are not described as the first race coming from America. Howard, though, did not hesitate to use some of Allen's conclusions to his own ends. For instance, Allen devotes his 10th chapter to the mysterious mound builders of America, and offers the following commentary concerning a mysterious effigy mound. In this case, however, nearly all observers conclude that it was a religious work. Mr. McLean, after describing these 3 figures, propounds this query: does the frog represent the creative, the egg the passive, and the serpent the destructive power of nature? Not a few writers, though not acquainted with the presence of the frog-shaped figure, have been struck with the combination of the egg and the serpent that plays such an important part in the mythology of the Old World. We are told that the serpent, separate or in combination with the circle, egg, or globe, has been a predominant symbol among many primitive nations. Howard draws upon this in Men of the Shadows, thus reinforcing his mythical connection between America, Atlantis, and the Picts. The ancient took a flaming brand from the fire, and with a motion incredibly swift, inscribed the circle and triangle in the air. And strangely, the mystic symbol seemed to hover in the air for a moment, a ring of fire. "The circle without beginning," droned the wizard, "the circle unending, the snake with its tail in its mouth that encompasses the universe, and the mystic 3, beginning, passivity, ending, creation, preservation, destruction, destruction, preservation, creation, the frog, the egg, and the serpent, the egg, and the frog." In depicting the contest of wills between Bran and the wizard, Howard seems to suggest more than a personal struggle for power between 2 men. Rather, the two are the focal points through which unseen powers seek to loose themselves upon the world. The wizard was the Stone Age typified. The chief, the coming civilization. The destiny of the Pictish race, perhaps, hinged on that struggle. The wizard warns Bran that if he wins, the serpent coils again. The serpent, as usual with Howard, is associated with the enemy, with destruction. Bran, on the contrary, is associated with the coming civilization. It is interesting to note that in Men of the Shadows and in the earlier playlet Mak Morn, Bran is referred as a chief. It is not until later in 1926, in the stories of Kull, that the theme of kingship, which we can see as precisely a step toward coming civilization, is first dealt with. It will be almost exactly 4 years before we see Mak Morn again, this time as a king. It is in the Kull stories that we next find the Picts. The Picts of the Kull series are barbarian allies of the ancient kingdom of Volusia. In the first published Kull story, The Shadow Kingdom, which Howard worked at sporadically between the summer of 1926 and September 1927, we learn that Kull, as an Atlantean, is a hereditary enemy of all Picts, though as king of Volusia he is their most important ally. He and a Pictish warrior, Brule, though their first meeting was marked by mutual tribal enmity seething beneath their cloak of formality, come to be fast friends in this series, and on more than one occasion it is Brule who saves Kull's life. The Kull stories are set in the far recesses of an imaginative past, long before the great cataclysms that supposedly destroyed Atlantis and Lemuria, so the historical Picts of the early tales were now adopted by Howard as a means of connection, not just with ancient times, but with the world of fantastic adventures through which Kull, and later Conan, would move. Howard completed 10 stories of Kull, including 2 in which he is merely an offstage character, a poem, and began 3 stories which he left unfinished, most written between 1927 and early 1929. Of these, only 3 stories, the first, Exile of Atlantis, and the 2 in which Kull is offstage, and the poem, do not include Brule the Spear Slayer and the Picts. Sometime in 1928, Howard wrote a story entitled The Little People, in which the Picts are featured, with inspiration from yet another writer added to the mix. In this story, set in the modern day, a brother and sister, Americans named Costigan, are in England during a European tour. When his young sister expresses disgust for the foolishness of Arthur Machen's The Shining Pyramid, which he considers a masterpiece of outre literature, Costigan lectures her, telling the story of the Picts essentially as outlined in the Romance of Early British Life. But the reference to Machen's The Shining Pyramid suggests that Howard has now taken the Welsh writer's conception of the Little People and added it to his conception of the Picts. In The Shining Pyramid, 2 Englishmen investigate the puzzling disappearance of a young woman from a local village, and ultimately are horrified witnesses when she is burned to death in a sacrificial ceremony by a host of loathsome underground dwellers, things made in the form of men, but stunted like children hideously deformed, the faces with the almond eyes burning with evil and unspeakable lusts. Their flesh is described as a ghastly yellow, and they speak to one another in tones of horrible sibilance. In explaining to his friend Vaughan the chain of deductions that led them to that horrible scene, Dyson explains, "I remembered what people had said about Annie Trevor's disappearance, that she had been taken by the fairies, and the hint came of the old name of fairies, the Little People, and the very probable belief that they represent a tradition of the prehistoric Turanian inhabitants of the country, who were cave-dwellers, and then I realized with a shock that I was looking for a being under 4 feet in height, accustomed to live in darkness, possessing stone instruments, and familiar with the Mongolian cast of features." Howard's linkage of the Picts with the Little People suggests that the once proud Pictish race eventually devolved into misshapen underground monsters. This conception would undergo another change very soon. In the spring of 1930, Howard returned for the first time in 4 years to Mak Morn, selling 2 stories to Weird Tales editor Farnsworth Wright, Kings of the Night, and the Dark Man. In the former, Bran has brought together forces of Gaels and Norsemen to join his Picts in what he hopes will be a decisive battle against the Romans. But the Norse leader has died, and his men refuse to follow either Bran or Cormac the Gael, insisting upon a king, neither Pict, Gael, nor Briton, to lead them. Through the sorcery of the aged wizard Gonar, King Cull of Valusia appears upon the scene and takes on the leadership of the Norsemen. In The Dark Man, Howard's Irish outlaw Turla O'Brien learns that Mak Morn has become a god to the remnants of the Pictish nation he forged. A brief synopsis of a Mak Morn story has also been found among Howard's papers, which seems to date from this time. It may, in fact, have been written before either of the completed stories and represent a clear transition in Howard's thinking about Bran, for in this synopsis, which deals largely with the intriguing of Roman commanders to seize power for themselves in the period following the assassination of Carausius, Howard states, "The time is between 296 AD and 300 AD. Bran is first identified as chief of the Cruithne Picts, but then as the Pictish king." In both Kings of the Night and The Dark Man, Bran is referred to as king of the Picts, whereas in Mak Morn and Men of the Shadows he was a chieftain. In Kings it is made explicit that Bran rose by his own efforts from the negligent position of the son of a wolf clan chief, had to an extent united the tribes of the Heather, and now claimed kingship over all Caledon. The battle recounted in this tale is said to be the first pitched battle between the Picts under their king and the Romans. Thus comes early in Bran's career. In this story, Howard clearly links his imaginary pre-cataclysmic world of Cull to our own historical world. The wizard, Gonar, tells Bran that he is a descendant of Brule the Spear-Slayer, and tells how only the Picts survived the cataclysm that claimed Valusia, Atlantis, and Lemuria, that they won up the ladder again to civilization before being overrun by the Celts and again hurled into savagery. "Here in Caledon," he says, "is the last stand of a once mighty race, and we change. Our people have mixed with the savages of an elder age, which we drove into the north when we came into the Isles, and now, save for their chieftains, such as thou, Bran, a Pict is strange and abhorrent to look upon." The Dark Man, set some 8 centuries after Kings of the Night, makes clear that Bran's initial triumph, while it forged the Picts into a united nation and enabled them for a time to keep the Romans south of the Wall, was ultimately in vain. Mak Morn fell in battle, the nation fell apart. Like wolves we Picts live now among the scattered islands, among the crags of the Highlands, and the dim hills of Galloway. We are a fading people. We pass. Some observers have noted the strong correspondence between Howard's poem The Song of a Mad Minstrel and Rudyard Kipling's A Pict Song from his book Puck of Pook's Hill, and suggested that Kipling's tale in that book of the British-Roman Parnasius and his struggle to hold the wall of Hadrian against the Picts and Northmen during the reign of Maximus may have been an influence on Howard's Mak Morn tales. It is a tempting hypothesis, with some strong circumstantial evidence. For instance, Howard's poem, with lines like, "I am the thorn in the foot, I am the blur in the sight, I am the worm at the root, I am the thief in the night," clearly echoes Kipling's, "We are the worm in the wood, we are the rot in the root, we are the germ in the blood, we are the thorn in the foot." When we note that The Song of a Mad Minstrel was sold to Weird Tales in March 1930, the same month Howard sold right The Dark Man and Kings of the Night, we might be excused for thinking it more than coincidence. Add to this the fact that in Kipling's tale of Parnasius he has him making tentative alliances with Picts and Norsemen who are threatening the wall, to try to hold them from attacking until Maximus is able to triumph in Gaul and return the legions he has taken with him, seeming to echo the plotline outlined in Howard's Bran synopsis, and the case seems even stronger. However, Kipling's Picts, which he, like Machen, refers to as little people, are far from being Howard's. "Picts seldom fight," Parnasius says. "I never saw a fighting Pict for half a year. The tame Picts told us they had all gone north, and none of the particulars of Howard's tales seemed to suggest a linkage with Kipling's. During the summer of 1930, Howard began a correspondence with the great weird fictionist H.P. Lovecraft. Among the earliest exchanges was a discussion which directly bears upon Howard's treatment of the Picts. Lovecraft, saying that he believed it probable that if there were any human inhabitants of the British Isles before the coming of the Mediterraneans, they were not cavemen or savages, but possibly some of the squat Mongoloids, now represented by the Lapps, wrote, "It's true that the Celts share most vigorously the myth cycle of fairies, gnomes, little people, which anthropologists find all over Western Europe, and attribute to vague memories of contact with the Mongoloids. Since these fair Nordic Celts found a smaller, darker race in Britain and Ireland, there is a tendency on the part of some to be misled and to assume that the little people legends allude to contact with those dark aborigines. This, however, can be clearly disproved by analysis of the myths. For such myths invariably share with the parallel continental myths the specific features, or tracks of these features, of having the little people essentially repulsive and monstrous, subterraneous in their habits of dwelling, and given to a queer kind of hissing discourse. Now, this kind of thing does not apply to Mediterraneans, who are not abnormal or repulsive from the Nordic standpoint, being very similar in features, who did not live underground, and whose language could scarcely have suggested hissing." Howard replied, "Your observations regarding the Mongoloid aborigines and their relation to the fairy tales of Western Europe especially interested me. I had supposed, without inquiring very deeply into the matter, that these legends were based on contact with the earlier Mediterraneans, and indeed wrote a story on that assumption which appeared some years ago in Weird Tales, The Lost Race. I readily see the truth of your remarks, that a Mongoloid race must have been responsible for the myths of the little people, and sincerely thank you for the information." Howard almost immediately put this new knowledge to use in The Children of the Night, which he sold to Weird Tales in October 1930, less than 2 months after the above exchange. In the opening scene of this story, several scholars are having a bull session in the library of a man named Conrad. The discussion turns to the nameless cults of Onjunst, and the author's contention that the Bran cult is still active. But when von Junst speaks of Picts, he refers specifically to the small, dark, garlic-eating peoples of Mediterranean blood who brought the Neolithic culture into Britain, the first settlers of that country, in fact, who gave rise to the tales of earth spirits and goblins. "I cannot agree to that last statement," said Conrad. "These legends ascribe a deformity and inhumanness of appearances to the characters. There was nothing about the Picts to excite such horror and repulsion in the Aryan peoples. I believe that the Mediterraneans were preceded by a Mongoloid type, very low in the scale of development, whence these tales—" "Quite true," broke in Carvin, "but I hardly think that they preceded the Picts, as you call them, into Britain. We find troll and dwarf legends all over the continent, and I am inclined to think that both the Mediterranean and Aryan peoples brought these tales with them from the continent. They must have been of extremely inhuman aspect, these Mongoloids." From this point on, Howard's degenerated race of underground dwellers are no longer identified with the Picts, as they had been in the Little People. In fact, in Children of the Night, when the narrator O'Donnell is recalling a past life as Aryara, he says of the abhorrent race his people called the Children of the Night, "They had once overrun and possessed this land, and they had been driven into hiding and obscurity by the dark, fierce little Picts with whom we contested now, and who hated and loathed them as savagely as did we." In People of the Dark, written in 1931, Howard makes clear that the Little People and Children of the Night are the same. In this story, too, we learn of an object they worship. In the center of the chamber stood a grim black altar. Towering behind it on a pedestal of human skulls lay a cryptic black object, carven with mysterious hieroglyphics. The Black Stone, the ancient, ancient stone before which, the Britons said, the Children of the Night bowed in gruesome worship, and whose origin was lost in the black mists of a hideously distant past. Once, legend said, it had stood in that grim circle of monoliths called Stonehenge, before its votaries had been driven like chaff before the bows of the Picts. The People of the Dark was returned to Howard by Strange Tales in September 1931 with a request for revisions. It was probably between that date and February 1932 that he wrote the story in which all these elements at last came together, a story that is generally regarded by most Howard fans as one of his very best, Worms of the Earth. H.P. Lovecraft, memorializing his friend, said, "It is hard to describe precisely what made Mr. Howard's stories stand out so sharply, but the real secret is that he himself is in every one of them. The best of Howard's tales are centered squarely on the viewpoint character. This is why Worms of the Earth is by far the best of the Mak Morn stories. It is the only one in which Bran is not seen through the eyes of another character." Howard himself recognized this, writing to Lovecraft shortly after this story was accepted. "My interest in the Picts was always mixed with a bit of fantasy. That is, I never felt the realistic placement with them that I did with the Irish and Highland Scotch. Not that it was the less vivid, but when I came to write of them, it was still through alien eyes. Thus, in my first Mak Morn story, which was rightfully rejected, I told the story through the person of a Gothic mercenary in the Roman army. In a long narrative rhyme which I never completed, and in which I first put Bran on paper, I told it through a Roman centurion on the wall. In The Lost Race, the central figure was a Briton, and in Kings of the Night, it was a Gaelic prince. Only in my last Bran story, The Worms of the Earth, which Mr. Wright accepted, did I look through Pictish eyes and speak with a Pictish tongue. This would also prove to be the last Mak Morn story Howard would write. In the same letter, dated March 10, 1932, in which Weird Tales editor Wright told Howard, "I want to schedule Worms of the Earth soon, for that is an unusually fine story, I think," he had returned 2 other stories, asking for revisions to one. These were The Frost Giant's Daughter and The Phoenix on the Sword, the first tales of a Sumerian adventurer named Conan, who would dominate Howard's fiction for the next 3 years. The Picts were, of course, present in Conan's prehistoric Hyborian age. They were the hereditary enemies of the Sumerians, who were themselves descendants of the pre-cataclysmic Atlanteans of Kull. The Pictish wilderness stretched from the western borders of Aquilonia to the sea, and it is on that border that one of Howard's finest Conan tales, Beyond the Black River, is set. Pictish carriers also play supporting roles in 2 of the James Allison stories, Marchers of Valhalla and The Valley of the Worm. But Bran, having made his foul bargain with the Worms of the Earth, is never heard from again. It is tempting to see in Mak Morn an autobiographical representation of Robert E. Howard. More so than any other of his characters, Bran feels the heavy weight of personal responsibility for his people, much as one suspects Howard must have felt toward his aging parents, especially his sickly mother. Bran knows that he is the last of his line, as perhaps Howard, an only child, may have felt he was the last of his. And Howard seems to explicitly suggest this connection when he insists upon his undying fascination with the Picts, and says, "Had I grown into the sort of a man which in childhood I wished to become, I would have been short, stocky, with thick, gnarled limbs, beady black eyes, a low, retreating forehead, heavy jaw, and straight, coarse, black hair, my conception of a typical Pict." Of course, Howard is at some pains to show us that Mak Morn differs from the typical Pict, though sharing the characteristics of being small and dark-complected, with dark hair and eyes. This was not, as Howard says, his own type. I was blond and rather above medium size than below, making it all the more noteworthy that so many of his earliest characters share these features. Howard explicitly states, for instance, that Bran physically bore a striking resemblance to Elborak, the first character he created some 2 years before Bran. His alter ego in the fictionalized autobiographical novel Post Oaks and Sandruffs is described as a black Celt, spare and gaunt, a dark youth. And he related to H.P. Lovecraft a dream he had had as a child, in which the characters matched this description. I dreamed that I slept and awoke, and when I awoke, a boy and a girl about my age were playing near me. They were small and trimly shaped, with very dark skin and dark eyes. Their garments were scanty, and strange to me, now that I remember them, but at the time they were not strange, for I too was clad like them, and I too was small, and delicately fashioned, and dark. Now, as I woke in my dream, this scene was fully familiar to me, and I knew that the boy and the girl were my brother and sister. It was not as if I had merely awakened from a sleep, returning to my natural workaday world, and suddenly in my dream I began to laugh and to narrate to my brother and sister the strange dream I had had. And I told them of what, if there was any truth at all in reality, constituted my actual waking life. I told them that my dream had seemed so vivid while dreaming it that I had actually thought it to be real, and believed myself to be a stocky, blond child living a waking life without knowledge of any other. Howard to H.P. Lovecraft, circa 1930, in Robert E. Howard, Selected Letters, 1923 to 1930, page 77. Many of Howard's Pictish characters share another interesting feature. They have names that share either a BR or GR consonant pattern. All the chieftains of the Picts have the BR pattern: Bran, Brule, in the Cull stories, Barilla, the Lost Race, Dulburn, the Ballad of King Geraint, Brogar, the Dark Man and Tigers of the Sea, and Brulla, the Night of the Wolf, while more primitive Picts generally have names with a GR pattern, such as Grom, Gonar, Grok, and Grulk, or names that fit neither pattern. However, the BR pattern is not reserved to Picts alone. Such characters as Elborak, Turlo O'Brien, Iron Mike Brennan, and Steve Bender also fit the BR pattern and are short, dark-featured, or both. All, like the Picts, are from early in Howard's writing career. Elborak, as we have said, actually predates Bran. What this suggests is that the BR naming pattern, and even more so the seeming identification with small, dark-featured characters, may have had roots in strong and lasting unconscious patterns, and that Howard's admiration for the Picts, leading him to adopt them as a medium of connection with ancient times, may have stemmed from something prior to his discovery of the Pictish race and creation of Bran, possibly predating even Elborak. But while he created many characters who shared these features, he rarely adopted them as his viewpoint characters. Even the earliest Elborak stories are generally told through his associates, until he was able to ally his strong emotional connection and storytelling skills in Worms of the Earth, following which he wrote no further tales of Bran. Interestingly, then, after Worms of the Earth, no Pictish character fits the BR pattern. We have Teanoga, Wolves Beyond the Border. In the first draft his name was Garog, and Zogar Sag, Beyond the Black River, in the Conan series, and in these stories, and The Black Stranger, the Picts are primarily howling savages. And in the James Allison tales, we find Akelka, Marchers of Valhalla, and Grom, the Valley of the Worm, both blood brothers to the Aesir heroes, during an era when the Picts seemed to be jungle dwellers. Even the great chieftain of the Hyborian age, who, 500 years after Conan, leads the Picts in overthrowing the Hyborian kingdoms and establishing an empire, while dark-skinned, dark-haired, and dark-eyed, is named Gorm. In other words, Worms of the Earth seems to be the last story in which Howard felt a really personal connection with the Picts, the first and last time he would look through Pictish eyes and speak with the Pictish tongue.